Welcome back to the Space School, otherwise known as PPSW. Today we're back with a brand new Star Wars theory, but before we go anywhere, thank you for 10K! Thank you guys, this is amazing. It's so much more fulfilling than it ever was on my other channel, and I'm so appreciative for it. You guys made this happen, and I want to tell you guys that I'm so very thankful for this new milestone. I would like to set a new milestone, so you guys pick either 25,000 or 50,000 for our next giveaway, but for everyone else, for those of you guys that know about the lightsaber giveaway, I'll be announcing details of that soon. I still have to plan out how I'm going to do the raffle. It's a lot of names that I have to get into a raffle, so I might do a live stream for it. I'm not sure yet, but we'll see how that goes. I'll give further details in the next coming days. As we go in, let's get straight into this video. One more thing, subscribe to this channel for a future giveaway, and also subscribe to our Twitch and join the Discord. Awesome communities both places. Let's get straight into the video because I know that's why you're all here, for our 10,000 subscriber special. Let's call it that. Today we'll be going into the inverse of our What If Vader Had Trained Leia video, and this time we'll be bringing into question what could have happened had Vader raised Luke Skywalker. How would Luke's interactions with his father from a young age have changed his outlook on the galaxy? Would Luke become more powerful than Vader and kill him, or would he rule the galaxy together as father and son? Let's get straight into our story, ladies and gentlemen. Our story begins in Mos Espa, with former Jedi Master Obi-Wan Kenobi. The desert airs are full of sand as swift wind blows dust and debris into Kenobi's eyes. It has been about a month since Kenobi's life had completely changed. It wasn't long ago that he was side by side with his buddies, the clones. Kenobi couldn't see much with the sand in his eyes, but what he could see was vivid flashbacks. Clone chatter, blaster fire, flak, the war. Though, the war was over. The Empire saw to it that the Separatists had been destroyed, and as they destroyed the CIS, they also destroyed the Republic. Everything this former Jedi Master knew was gone. He had spent the duration of this month migrating around the Lars homestead. He was still trying to communicate with his former master, Qui-Gon Jinn, who had died on Naboo more than 20 years beforehand. Kenobi was struggling though. He had lost everyone. Sure, he had Yoda, and he was also protecting Luke, but these events could have gotten better. They could have gone much better. The Order he loved died at the hands of the clones he served side by side with. The masters he respected as a student and grew to become friends with were gone. His dearly beloved Satine Kryze was gone, and his brother and student was turned to the dark side and was killed by Obi-Wan. How could he live with what had happened? Sure, it wasn't a ton of physical pain like the still-alive Vader, but it was a mental turmoil. Kenobi was now a hermit, wandering the desolate sands of Tatooine. No wonder Anakin hated it here, he thought, back to himself. Espa was where they found the boy. Maybe it was a coincidence, or maybe he was wishing that the boy would still be here. But Kenobi was in the city that Qui-Gon had found Anakin Skywalker. He remembered back to what his master told him in his dying breaths. He is the chosen one. What a fool Kenobi was to believe that. Kenobi's eyes cleared, filled with water. Was it tears or just the natural cleansing process? He didn't know or really care. He reached his arm up and cleared his thickened beard from the sand that covered it. Obi-Wan needed credits, and even more than that, a place to call home. Kenobi saw a fight break out in the street. A poor man was robbed by a slave owner. The slave owner, named Gritib, sent his henchmen to beat the man into submission. Most of the crowd kept walking, but Kenobi stopped. His hand hovered over his lightsaber, and his heart began to beat faster and faster. He stopped. His hand hovered over his mouth and trembled. He stepped back, away, into a back alley and knelt down, placing his back against some garbage cans, and wept. He was no longer Obi-Wan Kenobi. He couldn't do what he had known for 38 years of his life. Help. This broke Kenobi's will, and even more than that, it hurt his character. Closing in on Coruscant was a ship, a Venator-class Star Destroyer. It was sent to pick up an unknown Imperial agent known as Lord Vader. The Emperor made it clear to Imperial leadership that Vader was his pupil. Vader was still weak, clanking around the ship. His suit was heavy, and the burns still scarred every inch of flesh that he had left. The limbs he had lost to Kenobi on Mustafar were gone, but the scars of what Kenobi did to him were not. Vader wobbled to the middle of the command deck. The metallic parts made walking anywhere and everywhere a difficult task. Vader stood at the helm of the bridge. So much had happened to him in the past month. A lot of regret, Even more than that, depression. He wasn't Anakin Skywalker anymore. Everyone knew that Anakin was either dead, or, much like Sidious, dead to him. Vader looked out amongst the stars from the command deck. He remembered something he said to the man who gave him a chance. He remembered telling Qui-Gon that he wanted to be the first person to see every star in the galaxy. Sure, he never knew that leaving Tatooine with Qui-Gon would lead him down such a path of misery. Vader wanted to kill everything that reminded him of who he was. Anakin Skywalker was dead to him. And while Palpatine told him that he killed Padme, he was put in this place by his master, Sidious. If he were stuck and bound to the ways of the Sith, eventually it would be his time to overthrow the Emperor. Vader wanted nothing more than to have Padme back. He loved her, but as Vader, he had new ambitions: revenge. Vader turned towards the ship's captain and requested that they go to the planet Tatooine. Vader didn't know Kenobi was there, and Kenobi didn't know that Anakin, now Vader, had survived. But Vader was returning to Tatooine to remove himself further from that name, Skywalker. He resented it, because he was no longer it, and while he believed he needed to suffer for failing Padme, he never cared for Owen and Beru. Owen never deserved to even be close to related to him, and so he wanted to ensure that Owen and Beru died. Maybe it were senseless killing, but Vader slaughtered younglings inside of the Jedi Temple after all. The Venator arrived out of hyperspace, and Vader requested a shuttle to take him down to the surface. Vader looked down on the planet from the command deck as the captain prepared him his shuttle. Vader hated sand. He looked out the window and realized to himself that he never wanted to see this Dust Bowl ever again. Vader turned around and his cape whipped in the wind. Vader moved heavily through the corridors of the Venator, passing clone troopers who used to admire him. Now they feared him. He passed regular citizens become Imperial officers and watched as they cowered aside as he marched down the hallway. Vader was just learning the ins and outs of the infinite pain his master had constructed for him, due to his failures on Mustafar. The name Kenobi haunted him. Obi-Wan, Vader thought. It was a blank stare as he walked through the hallways. Without realizing it, he shoved a clone trooper to the ground. Vader was brought back to reality as he looked down at the clone trooper. The trooper didn't say a word as he shuffled away. Vader watched him, and then turned to see three others who watched Vader push over their brother. Without words, they filed out of Vader's way and moved as fast as they could. Vader continued walking down the corridors, and even though he was working on killing Anakin, he couldn't help but think, what would Anakin have done? He got into the shuttle and thought about it. He sat on a seat, adjacent from two clones. Vader didn't speak. But what would Anakin have done? Anakin would have apologized and reached over to help the clone off the ground. The clone would have made a joke back to him and the two would have parted ways. Anakin had respect. Vader had fear. He looked up and saw the two clones doing anything to avoid eye contact. Even through their helmets, Vader knew that they weren't looking at him. They feared him. The shuttle landed and Vader wobbled to his feet, but no one could see it. He was struggling to use the Force to keep himself balanced. Vader exited the shuttle as it touched down outside of the Lars homestead. He stepped into the sands that covered his boots. He didn't miss Tatooine, but it would be here on Tatooine where he would bury Anakin Skywalker for good. Vader walked into the homestead of Owen and Beru as they ran to see what the noise outside was. They ran to the middle room before the exit, where they were keeping Luke, their nephew. Owen and Beru stopped in their tracks as they looked into the eyes of fear itself. They heard nothing but heavy breathing in the darkness part of the room. They felt fear, true fear. As Beru was pulled by the Force into Vader's metallic hand, he stepped forward holding Beru with her feet off the ground. Owen looked up at Vader, who towered over him, as he reached for something to defend himself with. But it wouldn't matter. Vader would physically crush Beru's windpipe as he tossed her aside as she crashed into stacks of metallic pieces. Owen came running back towards Vader, but it also didn't matter. The small spear-like object that Owen was holding was pulled from his hands by the Force. Owen then tried to run. As he turned, he couldn't escape. He couldn't move. He felt his feet slipping, and fear flew through his body. But before the fear could fill the man, he was full of coldness. Vader used a spear and rammed it through Owen's back as he released him with the Force. Owen, who was still trying to move forward, ended up running into a wall, pushing the spear not fully out of his back, only to fall backwards and push the entire weapon back through him. Owen was still alive as he looked at Vader walk towards him. Vader had nothing to say, still. As he walked lightly, he pressed his boot on Owen's neck, and then he began to apply pressure, and slowly ended Owen's life. Vader released the boot and then heard something quite peculiar, the sound of a child. It wasn't an old child. The child seemed to be about a month old, one so very dependent on his mother. Vader walked towards the sound and found a makeshift crib. It wasn't the crib of parents expecting a child, nor was the setup. Nonetheless, if Vader wanted to kill off Anakin Skywalker, the boy had to die as well. Vader lifted his hand and then he felt it. Pure power. Vader didn't think it were possible. Not only did he not think it were possible, it had to be impossible. There was no way that Padme gave birth. The child wasn't a Lars though. It was a Skywalker. And that child was his. One thing Vader knew instantaneously was that Sidious had lied to him. A matter of concern for another time, he picked up the child and exited the homestead. Stepping over the bodies of Owen and Beru, he made his way back out into the unbearable heat. He walked towards the shuttle and requested that the two clones go out and burn the homestead to the ground. And so, without hesitation, the two clones went out and burnt the homestead to the ground. They didn't see the child that Vader was holding, and he wanted it to stay that way. As the homestead began to burn, the troopers turned and started walking back to their shuttle. Vader looked at them from the shuttle and raised his hand. Two cracks could be heard as the two clones dropped to the ground. Vader told the ship's pilot to take off. The ship was heading back to the hangar bay on the Venator. It was an unsanctioned deployment and Palpatine wanted answers. Vader took the child back to his quarters and returned to the bridge, preparing a response. As he walked through the hallways, he knew he had to keep himself in check. If he gave away too much emotion, he could ruin the grand plan he was now creating. Vader walked into the command bridge, and a communication from his master came in. Vader knelt. Sidious raised his voice at Vader, asking why he had returned to Tatooine. Vader told his master that he was killing off the remainder of who he was. Sidious, without hesitation, congratulated his apprentice. He told Vader to go to an ancient Sith planet named Crayus II. He wanted Vader to fetch a Sith holocron. Because it was an ancient Sith temple before the rule of two, Vader would be able to retrieve the holocron without the need of another Sith. Palpatine was still unaware of Luke's presence. This was what Vader wanted. Palpatine didn't travel much further than Korriban. The other Sith homeworlds didn't have what he really wanted or needed to be there in person to see, so he sent Vader to do his dirty work for him. He also saw this as a way to continuously torture his apprentice. Mindless tasks that would simply make Vader's life drag on and on. Vader nodded, and so Vader was dispatched to the ancient Sith world of Crayus II. As Vader told the captain the location, the captain had the crew pinpoint the coordinates in the Navicommuter as they jumped into hyperspace. On Tatooine, Kenobi was riding his Eopie when he saw smoke in the distance. He was having a difficult time already. He hoped it weren't the Tusken Raiders. He also hoped that it weren't a band of pirates. Kenobi jumped off his Eopie and ran over a hill. Wind, dust, sand flew in the air as his cape whipped off his burning body. His old Jedi outfit lay beneath. He still hadn't found much other clothes to change himself into. As he ran, his beard filled with sand and his eyes began to get covered as he raised his hand to cover his eyes. He kept running as fast as he could. There was nothing in the galaxy that could stop him. He arrived as the smoke covered him. His Jedi overtunic was still charred from Mustafar, but now the smoke and soot were covering what wasn't already burned. Tears rolled down from Obi-Wan's face. It was the one day he left, the one day he wasn't watching like a hawk. He fell to his knees, but he couldn't let the weakness of this apparent failure stop him. He ran into the homestead. Smoke covered the air as Kenobi got lower and lower to the ground. He saw Beru and ran over and touched her forehead, but it were no matter. Every bone in her neck was broken. Obi-Wan saw Owen and knew instantaneously that Owen was gone. Obi-Wan went to where the makeshift crib was, and the child, too, was gone. Sidious, but how? Kenobi started coughing. He ran out of the homestead and fell to his knees again. All the sulfur he breathed in on Mustafar was enough to give him asthma, but the smoke inside of the burning building wasn't enough. Kenobi let go of the Force. He felt free for a moment, though his hands and knees were covered in sand. Kenobi had been using the Force to conceal Luke and his own location. Apparently, the Force range that he was keeping on Luke had a limit. Kenobi looked up and saw 2 clones that were dead. He hadn't noticed them beforehand. The same thing that happened to Beru happened to these clones. They were killed by a powerful, angry Force user. Maybe someone who didn't want the clones to know that they were here. But nonetheless, Kenobi decided what to do, and what to do was right by the clones and the remainder of the Lars family. Bearing Owen Lars, Beru Lars, CT-7687 and CT-9009, Kenobi walked away. He took his Eopie back to his residence inside of a dark cave. Kenobi sat, without speaking, without blinking. His greatest failures became consequential, not just for himself, but for the galaxy. Kenobi toiled over this. It was driving him insane. If he had killed Maul on Naboo, maybe Qui-Gon would live. If he had killed Maul, maybe Satine would be able to save Mandalore from the chaos. If he were ready or a better teacher, he could have been what Anakin needed him to be. Now he failed Anakin, not Vader, but Anakin in the afterlife. He failed Anakin and Padme by letting Luke slip into the clutches of evil. Kenobi had to do something, but he had no way off planet. He needed to find a way to get to Bail or to Yoda. Whether Bail and his wife liked it or not, their adopted daughter needed to be trained in the ways of the Force, because the family that was Skywalker was being torn apart by who Obi-Wan presumed to be Sidious. While at the end of the day, it were Anakin who sowed the seeds of downfall into his family's lineage, both for Luke and Leia, Kenobi regardless needed to find a way off-world. Vader's Venator, meanwhile, arrived at Crayus too. The Sith had abandoned the planet for thousands of years beforehand. There wasn't much to see. Most of the Sith temple that was visible was the top. But there was valuable information inside, and with that information he would use it with his son, Luke. While Vader didn't know that that was the name that he was referred to, he did know that Anakin and Padme picked out a name for the boy. And a girl, whichever their child became. Of course, they could have known, but they didn't want to ruin the surprise. While Luke would be the boy's name, it was almost like Vader was holding on to Anakin while trying to move past him. Because Anakin was in there somewhere. But that didn't matter now. His son was his son, meaning that Luke would be destined to be at least as powerful as he could have been if he hadn't lost to Obi-Wan. Anakin would have been more powerful than any Force user in the galaxy. Maybe, just maybe, Luke could become this. It would take patience, but it would be the ultimate revenge against Palpatine's grooming over the last 20 plus years since Anakin first arrived on Coruscant. Vader carried his child into a shuttle and departed for the planet below. As they arrived on the planet's surface, Vader walked out holding his son, Luke, much like Anakin had an affinity for the dark side of the Force. Luke perked up when he saw the temple. Sure, he was only a month old, but the Force was strong with him. Vader walked to the top of the temple and placed his son down on an altar. Then, he used the Force to open up a passageway into the depths of the temple. Vader needed to do something about his son. He needed to keep him hidden from the Emperor, and so, he recovered 2 Sith Helicrons. 2 of the same. Vader grabbed a third. This temple used to be an artifact room, a library of sorts. The Sith had many important artifacts and documents kept here. Outside of the temple, a group of women came running to see who had landed. They ran to the top of the temple, where they had seen a massive, dark figure disappear. As the women ran to the top, they saw a child. They gathered around him. They all wore cloaks that concealed their faces, though it didn't take much to conceal anything. The planet was controlled by the darkness, and it was influenced by the power and the dark side of the Force. These women were a part of a group of Sith loyalists that had been on the planet since the Sith had left. Their name were the Sith Perpetual. The women turned when they heard breathing. a large figure climbed out of the hidden stairwell. They all kneeled before Vader. They knew he was a Sith, and they knew the Sith had returned. Vader was puzzled, but then he realized he knew of the Sith Perpetual. He hadn't realized that they still existed. They only existed here on Crais 2, so commandingly he demanded that they take care of his son for him. The thing about the Sith Perpetual is that they were completely obedient to the most powerful Sith Lord they interacted with. They weren't Force users themselves, mostly just peasants, who saw the Sith as gods. Because the Sith were all-powerful with the Force, the women looked at Vader, and they rose. Vader looked down at his child and knelt before him. Vader handed Luke a Sith holocron, and though the infant was hardly able to hold it, he did. Vader gently touched his son's holocron with his own. This created a holocron bond. Now Luke and Vader would be able to communicate, because the dark side of the Force. Vader felt confident in the Sith Perpetual. He believed that they would take care of his son. Vader would be able to train his son using the dyad of holocrons. The women gently picked up Luke and carried him away from Vader. As he watched, they ran into the smog that covered the lower half of the temple. Much like the women of the Sith Perpetual, Vader descended into the darkness below. His shuttle illuminated the darkness as his ship rose into the atmosphere. As Vader returned to the Venator, he placed his holocron in his quarters while carrying his master's. The holocron he was going to give Sidious was the one that his master wanted. Vader walked towards the bridge and the ship launched into hyperspace. The journey through hyperspace left Vader on the deck thinking about all he could do with his son. It was something that Vader looked forward to. And while having a son could bring Vader from the darkness, it could also drive him deeper and deeper into it. And for Vader, it pushed him deeper and deeper into a path of revenge. It was revenge on Kenobi and Sidious, a path that he looked into with great detail and planning, flipping the Empire over into the rule of Lord Vader. This would take years of careful planning and obeying his master's game. Until that time, though, Vader had to prepare himself for the eventual duel of his life. This line of thought took Vader away from the current moment. Blue and white lines illuminated across the dark skeleton that was Vader's suit. He remained steadfast on the bridge of the Venator. Clone troopers and Imperial officers walked by him and continued carrying out the operations of the ship until Vader's thoughts were stopped, and the bassy sound brought by the ship out of hyperspace. There it was, the city world of Coruscant. Vader had a meeting with his master, and so he traveled down to the surface within his shuttle. Vader approached the Senate chambers where the Chancellor's office now belonged to the Emperor of the Imperial Senate. Vader walked through the halls. He wasn't approached by anyone, but he was feared by everyone. Everyone, of course, who wasn't his master, Lord Sidious. He entered his master's office and knelt before his master's chair. Vader raised his hand and showed Palpatine the holocron he collected. Palpatine lightly raised his hand and pulled the holocron from Vader's hand using the Force. He examined it and then stood up. He congratulated Vader on his accomplishment. From here on out, Palpatine had a lot of missions he'd send Vader on. And from here, time would blur together for Vader. For the next 13 years, he'd earn himself a Crimson Blade and learn more knowledge of the dark side of the Force. He would also communicate with his son and teach him the ways of the Force. Vader also, in this time, would return to Crais 2 and teach his son in person the ways of the dark side of the Force. As Vader killed more and more Jedi, he found a lightsaber to give and save for his son. The first real task that Vader had for his son was bleeding the lightsaber crystal of a fallen Jedi. Vader took time away from his Imperial missions to spend time with his son. Luke got accommodated with this schedule, but he also found a place of belonging with the Sith Perpetual. Though Luke was always eager to interact with his father, he always found home with the people who took care of him. Because of the dyad of holocrons, Luke and Vader were able to communicate with one another, and Vader was able to walk his son through training on a daily basis. This training helped Luke become a powerful young Force user. Even more than that, the Sith Perpetual were giving Luke assistance with his training in accordance to Lord Vader's demand. Luke, by the age of 13, was already rivaling the power that Anakin had achieved by Revenge of the Sith. During this 13-year period, Obi-Wan was eventually able to find himself off-world and make his way to Alderaan. The difficult task of the former Jedi Order was asking parents if the Jedi could adopt their child into their order. Obi-Wan went to Bail and told him that Luke was stolen by the Emperor. From what Obi-Wan knew, this was most likely to be true. Bail knew what the implications this could have for the galaxy, especially if Luke harnessed the dark side of the Force. Bail and his wife said goodbye to their adopted daughter months after taking her in. Obi-Wan knew the most important thing he could do was bring her to Master Yoda, and while both Jedi realized that they had failed their order, they needed to be proactive in resolving the problems they had created. Yoda would be mostly responsible for the training of Leia, while Kenobi would be continuously on and off world. Because Dagobah was covered by the dark side of the Force, it would keep Yoda, Kenobi, and Leia safe. But whenever Kenobi left, he was making himself vulnerable. Kenobi, though, wanted to find and save Luke from the clutches of evil, and while Yoda disagreed with Obi-Wan's great haste in resolving the mess that he blamed himself solely for, Kenobi was off. Obi-Wan ventured into the deep core hidden under a cloak that didn't look like it belonged to a Jedi. He also found a means of travel that got around the Imperial public travel codes. Obi-Wan struggled though. No matter where he went, former clones were suppressing populations they once served. He knew he couldn't do anything to help them. Just keep his head low. Eventually, after rummaging around the deep core, he decided that Luke may be on the former Sith Empire worlds. It was just a hunch, nothing more, but he only knew of one of these. It wasn't Kenobi's fault. Most of the Jedi only knew of the world of Korriban. After all, it was the birthplace of the Sith. Kenobi would travel to Korriban every couple months, though a close encounter made him decide to stay off-world. As Kenobi was leaving the world, he felt the presence of evil. That presence belonged to Palpatine. Kenobi knew he weren't powerful enough to take him on alone. Kenobi would return to Dagobah after years of on and off appearances to stay with Yoda and Leia. Much like Luke, Leia was talented naturally. Some may say even more talented than Luke. She had a natural ability for the Force, but just like her father Anakin, Luke and Leia were almost unattainable, naturally born Force wielders. It was incredible. As the years passed, Obi-Wan and Yoda both saw what Anakin could have become had he been trained as a child, and if the child that was brought to the council was trained by a Jedi Master, not an apprentice turned master. Yoda knew and watched over Leia's training with the growth of Kenobi's mentoring. He wasn't ready, and the council's inability to realize it were the ignorance of what would eventually bring the downfall of the Jedi Order. As those 13 years passed, Luke and Leia were opposites in the Force. Palpatine was ignorant to it, because in the Force, things didn't feel as if they had changed. Luke and Leia balanced each other out, though there was something important for Luke. Vader wanted him to become more active in Imperial works. So, he brought Luke in to be his right-hand man. The story of Luke was a Jedi who survived the Purge and was powerful enough and wise enough to join the ranks of Vader. Luke was more powerful than most, if not the entire Inquisitorius. The only issue was Luke's stature. For being Anakin's son, he wasn't nearly as tall as his father, and it showed still in his young age. But the height didn't matter for young Skywalker, though he went under the pseudonym of Darth Radav. It was Vader backwards, because they were one in the same blood, same name, and Luke was ready to be his father's pride. Luke came aboard an Imperial One Star Destroyer with his robe over his head. He didn't have the stature of his father. Vader had an appearance that gave people fear, but Luke's small size made people look down to him. It was quite ironic, though. Luke wanted this. He wanted people to doubt him. He thrived in the fact that people would underestimate his power, the underdog of the Empire. For now, he had no one's respect, but alas, he would achieve it through hard work. His father turned to him and told him that he would have his first mission. He was being sent with some death troopers to track down and kill, without mercy, a squad of insurgents that were protecting 3 Jedi. Though Luke at this point was more than capable of taking on this task himself, Vader was being fatherly with his son. It wasn't Anakin Skywalker though. Vader had killed that name, and though Luke still carried it, the Sith Lord, that was Darth Radav, was truly the making of evil. Luke, with his cloak raised over his shadowed face, nodded to his father. He knew what had to be done. Luke carried one primary blade and adopted a secondary Shoto with his fighting form 5, just like his father. But Luke was more agile, like the young man that was once Anakin Skywalker. The ship departed, an Imperial landing vessel. The Death Troopers sat idle across from Luke. They had nothing to say. They looked at Luke through their helmets. Unlike Vader, they didn't fear Luke. Luke could feel it through the Force. He could tell they didn't respect him, but it didn't matter. That would all change. As the ship landed in a grassy field, a bright sun cascaded through the clouds in a tree line. Luke looked at it for a second as he exited the shuttle first. He had never truly seen light. Everything on Crais 2 was dark, covered in mist, and filled with shadows. The light here was remarkable, though he was still attuned to the dark side. He'd never seen anything so beautiful. He walked forward as the Death Troopers towered over him. They followed closely, eyes peeled into the trees. A lightsaber ignited as Luke blocked a sniper round back into the tree line. The shot would have killed the Death Trooper if he hadn't acted. Luke told his men to follow him as he raced into the trees. Covered in darkness and a robe of evil, Luke progressed through the forest at great speed. He saw the encampment, but the people were gone. Nearby, he saw the insurgent that shot the sniper round at him. Luke deflected the blaster shot right back into the blaster itself and had exploded, frying the man as he fell out of the tree to his death. The Death Troopers caught up, but as soon as they did, Luke found the tracks, freshly imprinted into the mud. So, Luke did what was needed of him to do. As he rushed forward, his men followed him closely. The trees were tall, but the woods weren't deep. They ended almost immediately. A small hill stood before Luke, and he knew that they were a trap waiting on the other side. As the Death Troopers caught up to Luke and exited the small woods, Luke turned to them and quietly rose one finger to his dry lips. He motioned to tell them to wait for his move. The Death Troopers understood as they quietly marched their way up the hill. About 20 of them in full. It would have been 19 without Luke's help. They then looked for Luke, but they couldn't see him. But then out of the forest came a blur. Luke was running and he used the Death Troopers as a stool, jumping 40 feet into the air. The insurgents didn't see him, but the Jedi felt him. Fear covered their faces as the entire group of insurgents and rebels turned to hear the massive thunk. 2 crimson blades ignited and Luke cut down the insurgents, using the Force to pull one of the Jedi towards him. He decapitated her. 2 other Jedi fled. The Death Troopers assumed that this was a signal and they began to move up and over the hill. When they came over the hill, they saw what Luke had done. The insurgents, those who were still left alive, were mutilated. Some had missing arms and others had missing legs. Luke cut through them without mercy. They were at the mercy of the Death Troopers, who waited for Luke to return. Luke wasn't too far away. The scenery was rolling hills, and on the other side of a hill, Luke hadn't need to duel. He decapitated one of the other Jedi and thrust his Shoto into the chest of the other. Luke carried the head of the Jedi he cut off back over the hill. As he walked down the small incline, he let the head roll down into the middle of the massacre. The insurgents, still alive, looked with fear, terror, and pain in their eyes. Luke smiled from beneath his cloak. He raised his blade and ignited it once more, and slashed down one of the insurgents, but not killing him. He cut the insurgent's hand off, sheathing the blade. Luke turned to the Death Troopers, raising his hand, letting out electricity of which was burning and slowly killing the insurgent who he had just cut the hand off of. As the man slowly died, painfully, Luke requested that his men execute the rest of them, turning and raising his other hand and unleashing his full power as the man withered away. The Death Troopers were quick, as they killed the man who stood before them. It was quick, but painful. The shuttle hovered over the men and Luke as it landed nearby. The men hustled on board the shuttle and Luke followed them on slowly, holding 3 kyber crystals in his hands, sitting down the opposite side of the ship from his men once again. They no longer looked at him with disrespect. These men respected him, and now they feared him. Even at his young age, Lord Radav was a fearsome young wielder of the Force, someone not to be messed with, someone to be feared. Luke grinned from underneath his cloak as he juggled the crystals in his hand. What would he use these for? What would he do with them? The ship returned to the hangar bay of Vader's capital ship. Vader was proud of his boy. The Death Troopers all stood behind Vader as they waited for Lord Vader to break conversation. As Vader walked away, all the men saluted Lord Radav. Luke much liked these men and intended to serve with them again in the future. Luke returned to his quarters quietly without saying anything to anyone. Rumor traveled through the Star Destroyer of what Luke had done on the surface of the planet that had just seen the death and massacre he had created. The crystals were laid out before him, 2 green and 1 blue. Luke wanted to save these. They, to him, were trophies. But even more than trophies, Luke desired to kill more, though the issue were that there weren't enough Jedi in the galaxy left to kill. Luke confronted his father in his father's quarters. Luke was the only person able to interact with Vader without his mask on. Luke didn't mind the sight, but he wanted to know where he could find and kill more Jedi, or insurgents. Vader told his young son that he understood the power and excitement that he had from doing so. But the time to kill more Jedi wouldn't be now. They were missions that Luke and Vader had to uphold, being a part of the Empire. Luke didn't understand this and rebelled against Vader's lack of enthusiasm towards killing Jedi. Luke yelled out at his father, calling him weak. Vader rose from his seat, telling Luke that there was a plan in place to secure leadership of the Empire. Vader placed his hand on his son's shoulder and told his son to have patience, reminding him that the power he had would become greater, and when it became greater, he would be able to help his father kill the Emperor. Luke calmed down. His heightened anger vanished like a gentle breeze. With rebellion on the rise, the Jedi became more and more scarce in the galaxy. The years would begin to drag on for Luke. He was a product of what Vader had done. Vader created a killing animal within Luke, and Luke grew with power. He also grew with rage. The Emperor also began to learn about this young acolyte who served closely with Lord Vader. Palpatine wasn't extremely troubled by this, but he was watching over this progress. He would begin to funnel Imperial High Command to emphasize Luke's powers. Luke at some point during the following years would first interact with the Inquisitors. Luke felt through the Force and knew that they were no match for him or his Death Squad, which was now officially recognized as an elite group of Death Troopers within the Empire. Luke didn't get along well with the Inquisitors. They were mostly former Jedi who realized that the light was weak. Little did they realize that they had nothing compared to the power of Skywalker. Though the Inquisitors failed missions, Luke did not. He had close calls, but he was never one to come back empty-handed. Serving as Vader's right-hand man for all these years, he'd grown accustomed to killing Jedi and taking their crystals as trophies. He was far more experienced as a dueler than anyone he came across, and while he was reaching his late teens, he was becoming the most powerful being in the galaxy, and Palpatine could feel it. He was in the works of devising a plan that would make it seem as if Vader had betrayed him. The plan was set in motion by Vader, who was given a report by the Emperor that there were a group of Jedi gathering on the planet of Mon Calamari. Vader had been there within the last decade because of a Jedi insurrection. The Emperor requested that the Inquisitors guide the acolyte known as Radav. The Inquisitors knew their orders, as Luke led the Inquisitors to Mon Cala. The Grand Inquisitor had tragically died the year prior, and they were at the hand of a rebel insurgency squadron with 2 Jedi serving alongside them. The report indicated that the squadron was present on Mon Cala, and the Inquisitors and acolyte Radav were being sent there to snuff out the insurgents and kill them. Travel through hyperspace was tense. The entire group of Inquisitors stood before Luke. He could feel that something were off. He felt that there was betrayal in the air, but he didn't know where from. He sat quietly, his face hidden below a dark robe. His piercing yellow eyes were hidden by the silence in his mind. The Inquisitors thought of making their move now, but the orders were to kill him on Mon Cala and blame the population. The Empire could risk another full-on invasion of the planet. No one could stop the brute force in the galaxy that was the Empire. But little did the Inquisitors know that their Emperor, their leader, had sent them on a suicide mission so that he could make young Skywalker his new apprentice. Steam filled the innards of the ship. The Inquisitors stumbled as the ship shook as it landed on the rough ground near the ocean that Mon Cala was known for. The group of Imperials exited the ship. The darkness clouded over the people of Mon Cala. A young Quarren approached the ship and asked why they were here. Luke muttered quietly that there were Jedi that they were looking for. The Quarren told Luke that the Jedi had been banished from the planet since the previous Imperial invasion. There would be no sign of Jedi here. Luke didn't move, but the young Corran began to get lifted off the ground. Luke was force choking him as he steadily marched towards him. Luke told the Corran that he had one chance for survival, and that was to tell him where the traitors were. The Corran, with the little bit of air he had left, let out a whimper, telling Luke that the traitors were behind him. Luke released the Corran as lightsabers ignited, several at a time. The Inquisitors was here to kill him, and they were sent by who? His ignorant father? Luke didn't have time to decide. One blade rose from his side. Luke looked up from under his cloak, and his eyes pierced the souls of the Inquisitors that he was about to dismantle. 8 duelists versus Luke Skywalker, Vader's pride. Luke steadied himself as the Inquisitors surrounded the young Sith. Little did they know of his true power. They'd seen flashes when he killed Jedi, but they were nothing compared to the power of 8 Inquisitors. The battle commenced as a 10th brother took the first swing, his gray hair blowing as the wind as he got caught in an interlocked duel with Luke. The 4th sister from behind Luke ran at him. As he felt this, he leaped over the 10th brother, and using the force, he pushed him at the 4th sister. The 2 fools toppled over, and Luke engaged with the much taller 5th brother. Their duel was exciting enough to draw the attention of the 6th brother and the 7th sister. Luke was surrounded, 3 versus 1, as the Inquisitors gathered around Luke. Luke parried the 5th brother and yanked his shoto from his belt and combated the 6th brother. The 7th sister told her droid to electrocute Luke, and it began to make its way towards him. Luke was caught interlocked with 2 duelists and several more surrounding him. As electricity rang out across his back, he fell to his knees, holding his blades apart from himself. This moment, Luke thought to himself, could be his last. But then the pain he felt coursing through his spine turned to rage. The 7th sister creeped up behind Luke Skywalker to land the killing blow, but as she got closer, she was blinded as Luke spun quickly on the ground, using his lightsabers to kick up dust. She saw nothing, and the Inquisitors moved closer. They saw that Luke had vanished, but they soon would learn that he hadn't. The 11th brother screamed in pain as the entire group of Inquisitors quickly turned to see Luke standing on the brother's shoulders, with his shoto deep inside the brother's back. Luke twisted it and then stepped off as the brother withered his way to the ground. Luke had escaped with diversion, and now he was the embodiment of evil. The remaining Inquisitors felt true fear. With his robe covering his eyes, a blur was seen. As Luke twisted in a great spin, he jabbed the 12th sister in the chest. The 5th brother was the first to engage Luke, who with both his blades ignited, contorted his body around the 5th brother. As Luke stood, the brother fell to pieces. 5 Inquisitors remained. Luke raised his shoto hand and pulled the 10th brother closer with the force. The brother dug his boots into the ground, but as he did, they began to shatter. As his boots crumbled beneath his feet were soon shattering. Every bone that was within his feet crumbled under the immense pressure the force was putting on him. Luke sheathed his shoto and whipped the brother into his hand with the force. Luke twisted his head and stared into the eyes of the gray-haired brother of the Inquisitors. Fear showered the brother's face, and the pain that consumed his feet was a mere joke. Luke wrapped his hand around the brother's neck, and while choking him, he drained the essence of force from his body. Luke grinned from beneath his cloak. The sea nearby crashed onto the surface, as if the mere presence of Luke was upsetting the balance on the planet. The 4 remaining Inquisitors decided one final shot. One final chance for survival. They ran at Luke, who stood deathly still. As they got to their feet away from him, Luke decapitated the 10th brother and collided blades with the 8th brother. Using the head of the 10th brother, he smashed it into the 7th sister's face. Luke twirled as a whirlwind and pulled his shoto out and cut the 6th brother's legs off. Luke's feet glided across the ground, and when he found his footing, he used the momentum to push into the 8th brother, shoving the brother back into a 1 versus 1 duel. He swung with immense speed, pushing harder and harder. The brother, with everything he had defending block after block, speed wasn't enough. He didn't have the power to keep up. Luke cut through the wrists of the 8th brother before moonwalking his shoto into the brother's neck. Luke poised himself for combat, but when the dust settled, the 6th brother was still shrieking in pain after losing his legs. The 7th sister was still getting to her feet, and the 4th sister was in fight or flight panic. Luke could see it, even behind that pathetic little mask that the Inquisitors loved to wear. Luke stepped forward, shaking his shoulders to jar increments of dust that had laid themselves upon his cloak. The two still standing Inquisitors were trembling. Fear. When they showed fear before, it was nothing compared to the terror they felt now. Luke wanted to know who had sent them, but he also knew they would never tell him. Holding his blade up, he sent electricity tumbling over the ignited lightsaber and from the tip of the blade over the ground and seeping into the sixth brother. Luke was remorseless. With a twist of his shoulders and tightening of the grip of his jaw, he glared into the eyes of the remaining two Inquisitors. He didn't say a word. The sixth brother was dying by his hand, and the fourth and seventh sister couldn't do anything to fight him. They looked at each other, not knowing what to do next. They could fight and die, or run and die. They knew their best chances were fighting, especially as Luke was currently distracted. They set their blades to spin mode as they creeped forward. Luke moved his evil glare to the sixth brother, and didn't stutter from his position. He watched as the sixth brother let out a final shriek of pain. At this point, the two sisters stood before him, moving to adjacent sides, hoping to catch him off balance. Luke lowered his hands and held his two blades to his side, waiting for them to strike. Both sisters ran at Luke from opposing sides. As their blades neared his skin, he used his flexibility to drop his chest to the floor behind him. As he looked up, he watched as two blades crossed right over his stomach and into the stomachs of the two sisters. As their blades sheathed, they both looked into the mask of one another. They killed themselves. Luke regained his footing and watched as the two of them fell to the ground. Of course, Luke wouldn't let this go. He sheathed his blade and lightly raised his hands, pulling his cloak back over his head. He lowered his hands to his hips, and then he used the Force to drain the entire being from each of the Force users. They stood no chance. As they looked up at Luke, he didn't blink. He stared blankly into their masked faces as he watched their lives slowly end. The true heir to the name Skywalker. Luke collected the kyber crystals and left the remnants of the former Inquisitorius behind as he boarded his shuttle. Luke sat down inside of the shuttle and juggled his crystals as he told the pilot to take off and head back for Vader's flagship. Luke sat quietly. He never spoke much anyways, but silence was where he felt the spirits of the ancient Sith, as if they were communicating with him. Growing up on an ancient Sith world made him susceptible to the powers of the ancient Sith, and since Crayus 2 was a world of information, Luke was filled with the deep Sith lore. As Luke returned to the Devastator, he swiftly rose from his seat. He glided through the corridors. Troopers saw the hooded man and stood aside, saluting him. Fear or respect, they knew Luke by reputation. The stories he and his death squad had accumulated made Luke into almost a living myth, a living legend. No matter. Luke, with rage in his eyes and intention in his heart, marched his way to Vader's personal quarters. When Luke entered, Vader was being put together. His helmet wasn't on, nothing particularly new for Luke. Vader's eyes shot across the room to see his son. Vader asked how the mission went, but before he could get a response, the doors to his quarters slammed shut, crushing the hinge they sat on. And Vader was pulled from his seat to the middle of the room. Vader twisted his gaze towards his father, asking why the Inquisitors betrayed him. Vader didn't understand, but Luke didn't have time for this. His shoulder blade rang out throughout the room. The echo bounced off the walls as the sound illuminated the room. Father and son, confusion and rage. Vader told Luke that the mission came from the Emperor, not from him. Vader told his son that Imperial High Command had been dictating all of Luke's missions. Vader expressed that he wanted to tell his son, but Luke had been so prideful of the missions that he and his squad had accomplished. Vader didn't want to disrupt the feelings that Luke had. After all, Vader remembered what it was like when the 501st started winning battles consistently during the Clone Wars. Luke helped up his father and apologized, but then he told his father that he wanted to kill the Emperor. Vader agreed that it was almost time, but there was a real mission that he had to accomplish. The squadron of rebels that had killed the Grand Inquisitor were currently in transition, and the Empire, without any Inquisitors, needed to spring the trap. Vader told Luke to go to the planet that they were on and kill all of the rebels. Luke nodded, and then used the Force to open the door so that he could slide out. The Imperial Star Destroyer rang out the code for Luke and his squad to go to the hangar bay. The very distinct Squad 13 made its way to the hangar bay. Another mission and another success was their intention. Luke was always still, but the Death Troopers consistently chattered amongst themselves. In the beginning, Luke hardly understood, even with the aid of the Force, what they were saying, though they had spent years together, and Luke understood them now, and to a certain extent, they understood Luke. The ship landed in a dense city, on which planet Luke didn't care. He was so focused on killing the Emperor, nothing else really mattered to him. The troops marched down the street and a squad of rebels could be seen. Luke looked at them, confused. He told his men to follow slowly. The Jedi were his. The younger Jedi turned around and saw the darkness emanating from the city corridor. He poked his master with panic filling his soul. Luke kept walking as his cloak fluttered in the wind like a butterfly behind him. He moved steadily, covered in black. The other, older Jedi turned and told his apprentice to hurry with the supplies they were taking. The Jedi stepped forward and his apprentice followed him, both igniting their blades. One of the younger women of the group was pushing the rest of the supplies with a larger creature Luke hadn't ever seen before. Two blades ignited as Luke stepped forward. Blue covered his face as they illuminated from the two Jedi, Ezra and Kanan. Luke took out his primary blade and held it, momentarily. He didn't ignite it. He kept walking. Like any rambunctious child, Luke was playing with his food. He didn't blink, sending chills down the spines of Kanan and Ezra. The supplies were almost fully loaded onto the ship, but even the ship's pilot who was helping load the supplies felt the fear and coldness that accompanied the presence of Luke. Kanan and Ezra worked best as a team, and they tried to enact on that, both jumping into attack, thinking that they could best the warrior of the Sith. Luke didn't ignite his blade, he just swerved in and out, dodging the lightsabers, finding himself behind the Jedi. From the ship, blaster bolts rang out, and Luke raised his hand blocking them, just as his father had shown him when he was such a young boy. Luke turned and looked at the one who shot the blasters at him. From the tips of his fingers, electricity shot out of his hands and hit the ship's pilot and threw her into the wall, knocking her unconscious. Kanan and Ezra simultaneously yelled out the name Hera. Luke grinned. The Jedi's weakness was their compassion. From their compassion, they would act erratically, causing them to fall out of line with the light they held so dearly. Kanan ran at Luke first, who still hadn't ignited his lightsaber. Another swift sidestep, but this time he grabbed Kanan by the ponytail on the back of his head and yanked him back. The Jedi was pulled so viciously his lightsaber tumbled from his hand as he fell flat on his back. Kanan groaned and Ezra saw his master was in trouble. Darting for the Sith, he realized he were running in place. Luke was lifting the young Jedi with his hand. Luke walked a bit closer as he turned his head ever so slightly to look at Ezra. He placed his boot on Kanan's neck without applying too much pressure. The Ghost crew, who were still up, started yelling, but their worries were ended when Luke was lifted off his feet and sent crashing into a pillar. Ezra fell and Kanan got up, coughing and regaining his breath. Zeb and Sabine piled inside of the ship and prepared for takeoff. Kanan and Ezra looked over and they saw two white blades covering the face of a Targruta. Luke whipped up from the ground, smiling like the fight had already ended. And in reality, it had. Ahsoka, much like the Inquisitors, had awoken a demon within Luke. He dusted himself off and removed himself from the rebel. Kanan and Ezra ignited their blades to stand against Luke. None of the three of these people had ever seen this cloaked figure before. He had a reputation, but nothing more than that. He was a pet to Darth Vader, and as far as any of the three Jedi knew, that was all he was, a pet. Luke stepped forward and then ignited his primary blade, this time igniting the crimson from within. Luke was pissed, and he was ready to strike without mercy, and without hesitation, just like his father taught him all those years ago, when he first tasted the blood of Jedi slaughter. Luke knew who the weakest Jedi was, and whipped his hand out to pull Ezra with extreme force. Ezra's blade fell to the ground as Ezra cried out. Luke viciously grabbed Ezra's face and held him down to the floor. Luke stepped forward, dragging Ezra, who was continuously crying out for help from someone. Anyone. Sabine looked on from the ghost and wanted to help, but the duel commenced as Kanan gave into that Jedi instinct to help his Padawan. Luke grinned as he parried and pushed Kanan back while holding Ezra in his hand. Ezra kept squirming like a worm under the Achilles heel, so helpless and worthless, yet in Luke's mind adorable to watch, thinking that there were any chance for survival. Luke pulled his wrist back and jabbed forward towards Kanan, catching him in the upper thigh, an intended strike. Kanan fell to the ground in immense pain. Luke knew that Ahsoka would be the true duelist of the fight, so, saving Kanan and Ezra for later, he tossed Ezra aside while lining his blade through one of Ezra's thighs. Both Jedi in incredible pain, with absolutely nowhere to go. They couldn't run or escape by themselves. Sabine and Zeb ran from the ghost, but Luke, before engaging with Ahsoka, used the Force to shove them all back into their ship. Luke engaged with Ahsoka. She was a powerful duelist, but her blades of purity told Luke that she wouldn't go the extra mile for the kill. She was more pure than a Jedi, and this meant an experience of toying with the former Jedi. Luke knew nothing about this duelist, but using her goodness against her, he sheathed his blade mid-duel and used the Force to stop one of her blades in action. Luke twisted under the blade and outside of its range. Ahsoka could move the rest of her body, just not her arm and the lightsaber in front of it. Luke decided Kanan would be perfect for the choice. Using the Force, he lifted up Kanan and slowly started moving him towards the frozen blade. Ahsoka needed to do something. If she didn't, she would kill Kanan. She panicked trying to sheath her blade, but she couldn't. Luke placed Kanan in front of the blade and then gently moved his hand. In the swing and intention Ahsoka had shoved her blade through Kanan's temple. Luke smiled with his evil eyes. Ahsoka's blade began to flicker. Even though she didn't want to kill Kanan, the intention to swing is what killed him. She was no longer pure, and that's what Luke wanted. She looked at Luke with tears in her eyes, almost as if she was pleading and asking why he had done this. And then Luke, without saying a word, ignited his blade and pulled himself into close proximity with Ahsoka. She tried to defend herself, but the shock of what she had just done, combined with the speed of Luke, she looked up and saw the eyes of death. Ahsoka slumped as her body fell through the lightsaber that passed through her. Ezra, in tears, was trying to crawl away. By this point, the Ghost crew knew they needed to leave. Kanan was gone, and the chances of saving Ezra were slim. As Ezra made his way across the street, Luke steadily followed him back, pulling out his Shoto as he drove it into one of Ezra's knee pits, gluing him to the floor. From out of nowhere, a small orange and tan clanker rolled at Luke. He looked at the droid and gently raised it with his hand. Bringing his fingers to the palm of his hand, Chopper began to squeal as metal and bolts began to topple in on one another. Ezra, in all the pain he's feeling, cried out Chopper's name. Luke crushed the droid and then walked over to the boy. The Ghost crew didn't know what to do. Luke knelt by Ezra and asked if the people in there were his friends, the closest thing that he ever had to a real family. And Ezra said that he didn't know them. Luke sighed and slyly said to Ezra, as if he'd spare them anyways, "What a pity." Luke raised both of his hands as the ship was flown into the air without a pilot or a destination. Luke pulled the ship back and forth as he whipped it across the sky in a whirlwind, sending the crew inside tumbling across the interior. Luke told Ezra that it was a shame that they weren't his friends, because if they were, they wouldn't suffer like this. Ezra begged Luke to stop, but by the time Luke said the word "this," the ship collided into a massive building nearby. The building then toppled over, killing hundreds of innocent civilians. Luke knelt down next to Ezra and said that his friends just killed innocent civilians of the Empire, an act of terror. He then told Ezra that maybe he should have stayed out of things, pulling his Shoto through the rest of Ezra's body. Luke stood and sheathed his secondary weapon as he looked at his men and motioned them back to their shuttle. It wasn't often that Luke took on rebels alone, but sometimes he wanted to enjoy the power that came along with being who he was. Luke did as was tradition after killing Jedi. He took their crystals and left the rest behind. Luke boarded the shuttle of Death Squad 13 and left. He sat in his seat and listened as the Death Troopers began talking about what the hell they just watched. They didn't really know if Luke knew what they were saying, but he did, and he enjoyed the boasting these troopers did for their leader. The ship arrived on the Devastator. As they left the shuttle, Lord Vader was waiting. Luke looked at his father and asked if it were time. Vader nodded, telling Luke that the two of them were going to visit the Emperor on the Death Star. He did warn that a lot of Imperial authority would be present on the battle station. Vader told his son that the time was now. Father and son walked to the bridge and watched as the interior of the bridge was covered in blue and white rays. The ship entered hyperspace for an encrypted location. Only few Imperial vessels knew of where the Death Star was located. Vader didn't say much to Luke, and that was okay. They had a bond as such. They stood side by side as father and son, and that was all the two ever needed. By this point, it were apparent if Luke wanted to, he could kill his father with no remorse, but he respected his father. Vader was the only one that Luke really respected. There was no one else that garnered that respect from him. Sure, the people that raised him on Crais too, but they also worshipped him like a god. Luke was a product of worship and preparation. As a kid, he was powerful. As a teenager, he was the representation of power in the galaxy. He could kill without merit, and without worry someone would stop him from doing it. As the ship came out of hyperspace, they saw a ringed planet, orange with dust and sand. They came across a massive structure, mostly complete though, missing a disc for a super laser, and also some key pieces across the hull. The Death Star was under construction, but Luke imagined what kind of power he could wield with that in his arsenal. And then his father spoke to Luke to imagine what kind of power they could wield with that in their arsenal. Luke thought for a moment. He and his father had two separate visions. Vader wanted to rule together, and Luke didn't have a vision with his father in it. The two walked down to the shuttle that awaited them in the hangar bay. The shuttle that awaited them was ready when they entered. The flight to the Death Star felt like hours, though it were only minutes. Luke felt the force flowing around everything. It surrounded each speck of movement the ship made, the movement that Vader made as his breathalyzer filled his lungs, and the silent movement that surrounded Luke as he sat idle. The ship landed in an empty hangar bay. There was no one to greet them, but a tall, lanky, older man. Vader spoke his name, and Luke winced. The icy-cold administrator was Tarkin. He guided the two to where the Emperor's throne room was. The room was finished so that he could enjoy time on his battle station when he desired. It didn't jut out from the surface of the space station, but it had a very clear view of space, and most of what the Death Star could see from any viewport. Tarkin told Vader and Luke that the Emperor were expecting them, as he backed off. The two entered the Emperor's throne room. He sat in a chair large enough to hide his body while he wasn't looking at people who entered his room. He sat in the chair large enough to hide his body while he wasn't looking at the people who entered his room. The chair swiveled around as he welcomed his apprentice and the young acolyte that's been stirring up excitement within the Empire. Luke may have been aware of this, but rumors of the being that was Luke Skywalker, otherwise known as Radav, was motivating troops of the Empire by his continuous victories. As Vader knelt before his master, Luke stood silently, as if he were asking his father why he knelt down to such a feeble old man. Luke never knelt to Vader. Luke looked on the Emperor as he rose, asking why it was that he didn't kneel. Vader didn't move. This was a part of his plan. Sidious kept talking, telling Luke that he was a powerful Sith, more powerful than Vader, impressed by the sheer power of Luke as he walked towards him. Closer and closer. Sidious pulled Luke's secondary lightsaber towards him, and then remarked about having not seen a Shoto in such a long time. He handed it back to Luke and then spoke quietly, telling Luke to kill his father. Luke didn't speak, he just looked at the Emperor. How did the Emperor know? But of course he did. He was a rival to Luke's power. It wasn't like Luke was exactly what Vader was supposed to be. Sidious, of course, would be interested in the apprentice he should have had. Luke was everything that Palpatine manipulated Vader to become. Of course, Kenobi had to ruin that, but no matter. Finally a worthy apprentice to the true Emperor of the Sith. Palpatine pushed Luke to join him, but Luke had no motivation. It wasn't Palpatine's offer, it was the fact that his entire life, he loathed the Emperor. He loathed Sidious because of what he had done to his father. He placed Vader in a suit and forced him into servitude for the rest of his life. And while these may have been exaggerated statements by Vader, they were from a certain point of view, true. Vader looked at Luke and stood. Sidious decided to use Vader as an example. He raised his hands and shot lightning across the room, a whirlwind of raw, dark power. The bolts could be seen from the outside of the room that Palpatine called his throne room. Luke looked at his father, who was on his back, howling in pain. Luke told Sidious to let his father go. Sidious then stopped, and spoke with the broken, croaking voice of evil, telling Luke that his father was weak, no match for the power of him. Luke looked down and walked forward. Sidious smiled, saying, "Good, good. Strike your father down and join me." Luke ignited his blade as Vader looked at his son, worrying that their vision on ruling the galaxy were not the same. But as Luke brought his lightsaber above his head, Vader feared for the worst. On the opposite end of that, maybe he'd see Padme on the other side. But then, his son did only what Luke Skywalker, heir to Lord Vader, could do. He shocked everyone. With finesse, Luke twirled over Vader and stood between his father and the Dark Lord of the Sith. Former Dark Lord of the Sith, Luke thought to himself. He raised his Shoto next to his primary blade, and Sidious laughed. He knew Luke would do this. Perhaps he even predicted it. Palpatine pulled out one blade after another, 2 blades filled with crimson against 2 blades filled with crimson. The room illuminated in the blood of thousands slain by the blades that stood between the 2 duelists. Luke stepped forward, and Palpatine jumped into the air like a tornado of force, putting Luke on the defensive quickly. He'd never seen anything like Palpatine before, never faced someone as powerful, but Luke was confident in his abilities. Both blades clashed, leaving the middle open, 2 blades on the right, and 2 on the left. Luke and Palpatine were face to face. Palpatine laughed as he stood poised in combat. Luke used his nimbleness and kicked forward at Palpatine and did a backflip, disengaging from the Sith Lord, who was now falling backwards. Palpatine dropped his blades and raised his hands. Luke, who was still in front of his father, sheathed his blades and looked into the eyes of the devil. Palpatine shot lightning across the room. Luke used one hand to take in the electricity storm, and used the other hand to push his father away from the storm that Palpatine had created. Vader was gently moved back towards the door. Luke then turned as Palpatine gave a full barrage of lightning that pushed Luke back a little. Luke took that intensity from the Emperor, decades of experience against a boy. Palpatine put everything he had into his Force storm. Luke reciprocated the true power of darkness and walked towards the Emperor, slowly but steadily walking across the room. Palpatine saw this, and his confidence in the abilities began to crumble. This was true power, true fear, true evil. Palpatine couldn't face down this evil. Instead of using his own lightning against him, Luke took all of Palpatine's Force lightning, and when he got close to Palpatine, he placed his hands on Palpatine's fingertips. Luke closed his piercing yellow eyes and absorbed all of Palpatine's electricity. Palpatine fell back and looked up with, for the first time in nearly 2 decades, fear covering his face. Luke looked down on Palpatine and grinned, saying that he wasn't going to kill him. He was going to use him. Luke had plans for the Dark User, and Palpatine was going to suffer. Like Vader suffered, but worse. This wasn't Vader's plan, but it was Luke's plan. Palpatine cried out a shriek, saying, "No, you were meant to kill me." Luke kneeled down next to the Emperor and grinned, placing his hand on the Emperor's neck and grinding his teeth, letting out an evil rebuttal, telling the Emperor that this was not that kind of story. Luke, like a prideful animal taking its prey back to its nest, pulled Palpatine across the floor. Luke harnessed some of his power and blocked Palpatine off from reality. Force ruthless separated Palpatine from his body. It placed him in a voided world that felt real. Palpatine was himself, but he wasn't. His soul was transported into another reality. It felt so real. Palpatine could interact with the environment, but it was like a dream, not real. In reality, Luke was preparing his throne room and his entrapment for Sidious. Vader reunited with his son after the battle and thanked him. Luke told his father to sit down in the Emperor's seat. Vader nodded to his son and sat down. For the first time in his life, no longer a slave. Luke smiled at his father, holding out his hand. Vader's hand reached out and the 2 hands met in the middle. A handshake of sorts, a bond between father and son. Vader left his seat to inform the role change to the Imperial hierarchy. Meanwhile, Luke ordered construction of a prison complex for Palpatine. The troopers said they knew him. They said they couldn't make it. There were limited materials. Luke thought for a moment. Luke contacted one of his men in the Death Squad 13 and requested that they go into his quarters and bring him something. They complied, and within 20 minutes, the trooper showed up, and in his hands were a bag. Luke thanked the trooper and then turned to the construction men. He told them he could use as many as he needed, and use the materials from the Death Star itself. Luke wanted this to be done ASAP. Keeping Palpatine in the void was a tedious task for Luke. It used a lot of power, especially since Palpatine was so powerful. It was a difficult task to continuously do. Within hours, a prison complex was completed and laid out in the throne room, and Vader had become seen in the eyes of the Imperial administrators as the supreme emperor of the Galactic Empire. Vader returned to the throne room and commissioned a throne for his son to be sat next to his. Luke was on the floor sitting when Vader returned. He saw the construction being completed at the end of the room. Luke rose and said it was finished. Troopers turned and introduced Luke and Vader to the prison cell for Palpatine. The cell would revoke all Force powers, while also allowing the two of them to torture and experiment on the Sith Lord. There wasn't a thing that Palpatine could do to stop it either. This pain would last until Luke let Palpatine die, because no matter what could happen to him, naturally, Luke would ensure his suffering was indefinite. On the other side of the galaxy, a young woman ran through the swamps. They reeked of toads and reptiles, but it was a smell all too close to home for this woman, leaping and swinging around without hesitation and complete commitment. Through the smog under the massive roots, to the tops and branches and over mighty rocks, Leia Skywalker was a true testament to the Jedi training and Jedi power. The equal in the galaxy to Luke Skywalker, Leia was powerful with the Force. She traveled lightly, only with Yoda, the little green former Jedi Master. Yoda spoke in riddles, but they always made sense to Leia. She grew up with Master Yoda and Master Kenobi after all. Her perception on life was very secluded. She didn't know anyone other than her masters, and she represented the perfect Jedi, balanced without a leaning towards the darkness. Someone who wasn't afraid of what hid in the caves down below in Dagobah's underbelly. Leia grew up surrounded by the eerie landscape of the swamps. Leia, though, was powerful, unlike anything either Yoda or Kenobi had seen. Well, they had, but they never wanted to admit it. It was their greatest failure, Anakin Skywalker. Leia had been told stories about her father, but not to the extent of becoming Darth Vader. Leia wielded a blue lightsaber, like Master Kenobi. She built it when Kenobi took her to Ilum shortly. Leia was dedicated and strong, with her mind focused on the now. Leia hadn't been corrupted by thinking about the future. Her mind was always where she was. She made a terrific student. She was always ready for a new day of training, and she progressed faster than Anakin ever did. Though being trained by two of the Order's best certainly does help coax someone into becoming the best. Leia's trials were easily passed, and unlike her father, she had no struggles with emotional attachments. Leia excelled in multiple lightsaber forms, but she chose a form that not only defined her legacy, but that of her father and her brother. Using Form 5, Leia was a powerful adversary. She trained her entire life to kill the Emperor and bring balance to the Force. Of course, she knew of her twin brother named Luke, but no one knew or heard of him since he was taken all those years ago. Leia, after her morning warm-up around the swamplands of Dagobah, returned to a small Jedi structure to tell her masters that the Force told her it were time. The Force communicated really well with Leia. She was very attuned to it, and it had a very strong connection to her. She told her masters that she returned to the caves, and the Force told her it had been decided. The fate of the galaxy had been put into the hands of Skywalker. No one on Dagobah knew that Luke and Vader had become Emperor, and so they believed it was possible that Skywalker was singular, as in Leia. The three Jedi prepared to fight the Emperor. Because of Luke having been ravaging through the insurgents and competent Imperial strategists like Grand Admiral Thrawn, the rebellion wasn't even a conception at this period of time. There were no leads to where to find the Emperor. The Jedi left the Dagobah system and made their way for a civilized planet. Much had changed since Obi-Wan last left the planet of Dagobah. The Empire was just starting out, tightening its grip on the galaxy, and now the galaxy were under the full control of the newly crowned Emperor Vader. When the three Jedi saw that Vader had been crowned, their shock was immeasurable. He had not only beaten and conquered his demons, but he had become the face of evil in the galaxy. To their knowledge, Luke could have been dead. Luke was only well known in the Imperial ranks. Most people who saw him spoke not of him, while those who faced him never came away alive. Luke was content staying in the throne room on the Death Star because there was almost no need for him elsewhere. Luke thrived experimenting on Sidious, draining Sidious of any willpower. There was absolutely nothing that Palpatine could do. He lost to Luke fair and square, and now he was living a life of torture. Luke, on the other hand, was trying to learn how to make Vader whole again, turning him into a real man, not a machine made to serve. Vader took the role of Emperor well, and while a few of the former Emperor's loyal dogs struggled with the change, there were no seeds of rebellion or deception within the Imperial ranks. Sidious built an empire for Vader and Luke, and it was fully operable with a Death Star nearing construction and a militaristic rule over the galaxy. Months would pass since Leia departed Dagobah with her masters, and since Luke and Vader had secured the role of leadership in the galaxy. Inside the Death Star throne room, Luke requested that Director Krennic and the Imperial Science Division tasked with operating and designing the Death Star were present. A small group of scientists and Director Krennic entered the room, escorted by Death Squad 13. The scientists linked up in front of Luke in the eerie dark room. A room that smelled like old books left outside in a thunderstorm reeked across the room. The ancient books and stories of the Sith filled the room, and the rotting body of Palpatine didn't help the smell either. Luke rose from his seat elegantly, as if he were pulled up by the Force. He walked over and slowly crossed in front of every scientist before stopping at Director Krennic. Krennic didn't say a word, much too afraid to unleash that rage that Luke had. Luke spoke softly under the cloak. He told Krennic that there were a traitor in his ranks, someone that would allow the entire project to fail. Krennic stuttered back a little. He didn't know how to react. He asked how Luke knew, and Luke said that he could feel it in the Force. The sanctuary Luke built inside of the throne room heightened his Force powers. He could feel what every being inside of the Death Star was thinking. He could tell anyone their aspirations, their failures, or their memories. Luke was extremely powerful in the Force, and it was as if the Force guided his every movement, even though it reacted negatively to the darkness. Luke called out the name Galen Erso and asked that he step forward. Luke contorted his body around and speared his Shoto at Galen. The lightsaber traveled through the air at immense speeds. Galen didn't have enough time to react, but by the time the sound of the lightsaber ignition could be heard by him, the Shoto was out the other side of his head. Galen's body dropped to the floor, and as it fell, Luke pulled the lightsaber back to him and sheathed it. He turned towards Director Krennic and told him to fix the errors that Galen had created. All of his information was in his study. Krennic nodded, and the scientists and Krennic left the room, guided by Death Squad 13. Luke hovered near the altar and knelt down, feeling the dark side of the Force course through him. He closed his eyes and meditated. Behind him, 4 royal guards stood at the attention. They were used to protect the Emperor, and now they made sure that Palpatine would never be set free. They stood like ghosts, silent and without movement, hovering over Palpatine's eternal desolation. Luke was getting closer and closer to achieving power that even Plagueis would yearn to achieve. The power to make man whole again, to make Lord Vader the powerful, nimble man he once was. Luke was getting closer and closer by the day. In the mid-rim, Leia, Kenobi, and Yoda set up a perimeter. They wanted to find out how to get to Vader, but it was nearly impossible. Vader traveled with elite men constantly, not to mention most people saw the power he could wield. Most of what Vader did was to ensure the Imperial Senate operated. After all, he was no political icon. But he was the man with power in the galaxy. Vader, since the imprisonment of Sidious, had upgraded his suit, becoming closer and closer to the man that was once Anakin Skywalker. Leia felt the pain of the people around the galaxy, and while Vader outlawed slavery around the Galactic Empire, and even ensured the downfall of the Hutt clans with the help of Luke, crime was hard to come by, and though the Empire had a massive militaristic regime, the galaxy was more peaceful than it had ever been before. Vader is respected as Emperor because he was a visual force of power in the galaxy. Though Leia knew that the Empire's rule had its positives, she was aware of the evils that sat atop of power in the galaxy. She believed that she had to stop it, but in her lost thoughts, she tumbled into some purge troopers. She was alone. Her 2 masters were separated on other planets in the mid-rim. The group of purge troopers were large. There were about 30 strong, and each individual was trained well enough to kill or capture a Jedi Knight. Leia was so focused in her mind that she was walking blankly through the streets. But when she bumped into the Purge Trooper, her lightsaber fell off her belt, and before them. Leia felt like she had the weight of the galaxy on her back, and when she looked up, a gust of wind traveled down the city corridor, flapping her fluorescent gray and tan robes in the air. She pulled the lightsaber from the ground with the Force, and she panicked. They knew she was a Jedi, or that she had taken a Jedi's weapon, both being major crimes in the Empire. The Purge Troopers ignited each of their individual staffs as they broke formation to surround Leia. 30 troops. Leia was well trained, but this was her first real opponent. She had never faced anyone else other than her masters. Leia's blue blade cascaded as a beacon of light in the city streets as day turned to dusk. Shadows covered the roads and people backed away, fearing to watch another Jedi die at the hands of the Purge Troopers. Leia was no ordinary Jedi, though. Leia stood her ground and ensured herself to be a vessel of light in the galaxy. Purge Troopers encircled the young Jedi closer and closer, twirling their staves as Leia moved into her personalized defense position. Instead of focusing on a natural state of combat Form 5, like her father and brother, she prepared herself for combat in Obi-Wan Kenobi's Form 3. When she felt a surge of electricity fill her back, she fell forward, as her face almost met the tip of a vibro staff. She used this imbalance to correct herself as she moved forward, using her flexibility to throw her feet over her head in a front flip, kicking the Purge Trooper in the helmet, sending him backwards. With her lightsaber, she cut his staff and twirled around like a blur of gray. Leia used the Force and shoved a row of Purge Troopers back into the building behind them. Leia then ran to their side of the line as the troops began to swing behind her with their staffs. Leia sheathed her lightsaber as she rolled beneath swinging staffs of more men. As she rose from the roll on the other side, she jumped into the air and twisted her body around. As she did, the Force pulled more of the Purge Troopers towards her. Leia ignited her blade, and as the men got close to her position, she cut their staves and their blasters so that they would be inoperable. Leia then moved into a crowd of Purge Troopers, using her flexibility and knowledge of the Force to deter those around her. The wisdom of Grandmaster Yoda and the finesse of Master Kenobi guided her throughout this combat. Fierce as the warriors of the Jedi's past, she moved elegantly, like a ballet through the mix of Purge Troopers. Leia was swift, using the Force often and using her talents with a lightsaber the rest of the time. She was truly Anakin's daughter. Using a lightsaber with such precise strikes, Leia cut through the blasters and staffs alike, using the Force to send Purge Troopers into one another by colliding their helmets with each other. Leia put most of the troopers on their backs or into places across the cityscape. None were killed, though. Some were hurt, and fewer were injured. Leia then came across the leader of the small enforcement. He was a Purge Trooper with yellow markings down his eyes. The Purge Trooper commander was the best of the group. He was the first one who got a hit on Leia before she sent the men next to him into a building. The Purge Trooper swung twice, missing both attacks, and then moved instantaneously into defense position, as Leia herself jumped into her more offensive, comfortable Form 5. Leia swung and hit the staff, pushing the trooper back further, moving forward again, and swinging her blade around and colliding with not just the staff and breaking it, but slashing the helmet of the man who was fighting her. The trooper fell backwards and looked up from the ground, paralyzed by fear. His ocean blue eyes met her amber golden eyes. She walked towards him as he began to panic, whipping out his blaster as it was thrown from his hands by Leia's slight hand movement. His face was covered in terror. Leia walked up to him and gently kneeled next to him, putting away her lightsaber and smiling. She placed her hand next to his helmet, and before he knew it, he passed out. Leia got up and turned as the crowd began to applaud her. But the worst was far from over, as the ground began to shake and the rattling of metal gears began to echo through the city corridors. Leia looked around the corner and saw an AT-ST walking down the line towards her, and behind it, a division of stormtroopers. Leia needed to do something, because if she didn't, the crowd had a good chance of being blamed for what had happened to the Purge Troopers. Leia looked around the side of the city that the troopers and AT-ST were coming from, and she saw a means of strategy that would allow her to engage the stormtroopers. As delicate as she was with the Purge Troopers, she had to be more intent with the stormtroopers. They could kill a civilian in the crossfire, let alone the damage an AT-ST could do with a group of people. Leia needed to act with speed, and she did, lunging across the street and using the skills so natural to her. From her training on Dagobah to propel herself to a balcony that was about the same height as the AT-ST. Leia then ran along the balcony's railings and jumped to another with great haste. Leia's speed was incredible, and as the AT-ST caught glimpse of her through the viewport, it turned, but for them, it would be too late. Leia was running with enough speed and at the right angle to jump from the balcony to the AT-ST, using her lightsaber to cut open the hatch as she threw herself inside of the cockpit. Leia turned to see two Imperial pilots, and with the Force, she threw them out of the tiny viewports and into the Imperial troops down below. Leia then used the walker as a diversion, jumping to the top and then off the back side. When Leia jumped, she used the Force to throw the walker towards the garrison. The men panicked and ran in every direction. Many were crushed by the walker, but more escaped. Leia landed on the ground and looked up. The troopers were beginning to discover that it were her. Leia ignited her lightsaber and threw it into the crowd of stormtroopers, cutting through several men at the same time. The lightsaber was summoned to a balcony above. Leia's speed caught the troops off guard as they turned their attention to fighting Leia. Blaster fire ignited the city corridor as red bolts flew across the city streets into the balcony where Leia was, illuminating the darkness. She had to get out of the position, too many troopers for her to deflect at the same time. Leia got to cover and came up with an idea. She leaned down so that none of the blasters could hit her, and so she closed her eyes. Thinking back to one of Yoda's teachings, never judge by size, Leia harnessed the Force, and a large object began moving. The fallen AT-ST began to shuffle a little. Few of the troopers noticed it, let alone took notice of the movement. But a moment later, the AT-ST swung around like a banshee, throwing stormtroopers across the city, smashing in the lampposts and buildings alike. The blaster fire began to stop, but the screaming did not. Stormtroopers stood no chance against the might of Leia Skywalker. When she opened her eyes and peered over the barrier, the few stormtroopers left fled the area in terror. Leia jumped down and ran into the shadows of the city as night covered what had just occurred. Meanwhile, on the Death Star, Luke requested that his father return to the throne room. Vader's summoning was welcome when he saw his son, with a daring smile covering his face. Luke spoke softly, telling that he figured out how to bring him back to the man he used to be, after months of experiments. Vader was excited to become a man again. The mask was stuffy and the pain was insufferable, even with the modifications to his armor. Luke requested that while Vader was being summoned, to have the medical droids in a makeshift medical bay be constructed for Vader, for when he arrived. Vader was placed under oxygen as a Bacta tank left a glowing shadow on Vader's exposed person. Machine was no longer attached to Vader as he lay on the medical table. Luke looked at the rotting Emperor and told him that the fun would begin now. Luke knelt down between the medical table and Palpatine's prison cell, and Palpatine's face was covered in fear. It didn't matter though. Palpatine's limbs were slowly being removed because of the immense power of Luke's Force. They are immediately cauterized. 2 arms and 2 legs were separated from the husk of skin that was Palpatine. Luke transferred these limbs through the prison into an unused bay that had confused Palpatine for the longest time. But this bay, with the aid of Luke's Force, turned the limbs of Palpatine into the limbs of Anakin. Though this was the easiest part. Medical droids surrounded Vader, who lay incapacitated on the medical table. Luke pulled out all 4 of the limbs and placed them at the appropriate places as the medical droids went to work. Luke focused all of his power on this process, aiding the droids and even giving the ligaments the ability to be controlled by Vader. The droids continued their work, and Luke released a little bit of lightning to increase the droids' workflow. The process was near completion as Luke lifted his father into the Bacta tank and placed him in there with a respirator ensuring his life support. Luke turned and opened his eyes as he looked at Palpatine, frowning at this former Sith Lord who ached across his body. Luke used the Force and began to electrocute Sidious, to make his burns seethe deeper into his skin. Palpatine groaned in pain, unable to do anything about it but wither in his agony. Luke felt the presence and turned to see two glowing Sith eyes. Anakin Skywalker, the Darth Vader of Operation Nightfall, was reborn. Lifted from his bacta tank, he stood weakly. His legs were his again, but they were shaky. Nearly 20 years of not being used. It would take time for Vader to regain his confidence as a fighter, and as a nimble Vader that he once was. But for now, Luke guided him back to his room to lay down and sleep. Inside of the throne room, the makeshift medical bay was being put away by Imperial stormtroopers. Luke eventually returned and made his way to the throne room to await his briefing from Grand Admiral Thrawn. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the galaxy, Obi-Wan and Yoda regrouped with their apprentice Leia. Kenobi had heard communication through Imperial chatter that Grand Admiral Thrawn was going to the planet Geonosis to talk to the Emperor. They all decided that this would be the moment and time to give light and hope to the galaxy. It would take weeks for the Jedi to get to Geonosis. They had to remain hidden, especially after Leia's little excursion with Purge troopers and stormtroopers a couple months ago. As the Jedi approached the Death Star, they prepared for the most important battle in any of their lives. Inside of the Death Star, Luke and Vader sparred in great haste and ferocity. Palpatine watched from his holding chamber as Luke and Vader fought as father and son, becoming more and more powerful. Anakin had become attuned to his new legs and arms, fighting like the younger man that was Anakin Skywalker. Luke and Vader stopped their duel and sat down at their respective thrones. Vader looked over towards his son and told him that he were proud of him. Vader was appreciative for Luke and made sure that Luke was aware of it. This wasn't a breach on the dark side, it was just the appreciation of father for son. Luke told his father that he always wanted to do right by him, no matter what. Though both thrones twisted around as fire was heard and screaming men too. The troopers of Death Squad 13 were being slaughtered by the Jedi. Vader reached over as if he were telling his son to stay. But these were his men, the men he'd grown up with and served with for so many years, gone within seconds. The doors flew open as two older Jedi and a younger woman walked through with their lightsabers drawn. Palpatine gazed over from his tank and watched. The Jedi marched forward and stood in the middle of the throne room. Vader asked who the woman was, because he knew the other two after all. An older Kenobi was in a bit of shock seeing that Anakin Skywalker sat in front of him. Leia stepped forward and proclaimed to be Leia Skywalker, daughter of Anakin Skywalker, hero of the former Republic, here to end the line of evil that came from the top of the Empire. The two Sith looked at each other and slowly stood up. Luke stepped forward towards his twin sister, interacting for the first time since birth. The two twins walked towards each other. They stopped face to face, and they both raised a hand opposite of one another. As they touched hands, they looked at one another, and they could see the slight similarity between themselves. They were most certainly brother and sister, but there was an issue. As much of a dyad these two were in the Force, they were polar opposites, one raised in the light and the other raised in the dark. They knew that if they wanted to secure their power, they would have to kill the other, because at the end of the day, they would never become allies, and at the end of the day, they were representations of polar opposites of the Force. The two stepped away from one another, and their lightsabers' ignition rang out across the throne room. Green, blue, and red illuminated the entire darkness of the room, and Vader stepped forward to engage his former master, pushing an offensive against the older, more frail Obi-Wan Kenobi. Yoda leaped into action against Luke as Luke whipped his Shoto from his belt to deflect the former Grand Master, as he used his primary to engage Leia. Vader and Kenobi locked in hand, former master and apprentice entrapped in a duel of the fates. Luke pushed Leia off him and turned to face Yoda, an old frail master who jumped in the air and did flips to engage with Luke. Yoda wasn't much though. Luke kicked Yoda mid-air across the room as he collided with the wall. Yoda fell weak to the ground, and many of the bones in his little back were broken. Luke sheathed his Shoto and picked up the body of Yoda with forced choke, pulling him towards his duel with his twin sister. Luke and Leia were in a fierce battle, but on the other side of the room, Vader and Kenobi's duel was nearing completion. As Vader used his raw power and energy, everything he learned while being the hulking Lord Vader. Vader twisted Obi-Wan's blade to the side, knocking Kenobi off balance, and then striking him down with all of his anger. Kenobi didn't vanish into the Force. As he died, he fell to the floor below him. Vader pulled the blade of Kenobi back to him and moved back to his throne. He watched as Luke engaged in fierce combat with Leia. Leia and Luke were interlocked. Leia was beginning to lose her cool because Yoda was being choked near their duel, and she had just watched her other master die. Luke pulled back from Leia while throwing Yoda with the Force into position that he was previously in. Leia swung and cut through Master Yoda. Yoda's life ended with torture and death at the hands of his most prideful student. Leia dropped to her knees, realizing what she had done. Luke grinned. He intended on this, igniting his Shoto to kill his sister he never had. As he raised his blade, a green blade illuminated from below him. Leia jumped into action with green and blue, pushing back Luke. She was out of balance, using the dark side that was natural within her bloodline. Luke was taken aback by this offensive. He fell back a little, but he caught himself. Leia was powerful when she utilized the dark side of the Force. The two of them dueled fiercely. Luke's primary blade was knocked away from him, and he began to fight with his Shoto, his only chance of defense. Caught interlocked with Leia's primary blade, she whipped Yoda's blade at him. Luke was able to use the Force to stop it, but Leia was incredibly strong with the dark side in her. She etched her way with the blade into Luke's skin, burning him and cutting into his ribs. Luke howled in pain, but a swift movement got him out of it as he used his Shoto and swiped down at Yoda's blade, destroying it. Leia stepped back before using her primary blade to swing down, interlocking blades with Luke's primary and Shoto. Leia used her strength to throw Luke's Shoto to the side and push him back off balance. Luke fought back though, a ballroom dance of sorts, brother and sister. They were evenly matched, as they both harnessed the dark side of the Force. Swinging back and forth ferociously, they interlocked in a stiff collision of blades. Luke and Leia spun in a circle from their immense duel, and at the same moment they both drove their blades through each other's chests. A moment of shock throughout the room. Vader jumped forward and Palpatine smiled. Luke and Leia looked at each other, with pain and shock in their faces. Vader ran forward and held his son in his arms, but then, at the end, the daughter he never had, he held her too. Both of his children died at the same time, with them the legacy and the memories of Padme. Vader sobbed as Palpatine, in the end, always winning. As Vader watched his two children die, Vader laid his children to rest forever, and made sure that Palpatine would continue to suffer for the rest of his life. Vader would take pages out of Luke's book and ensure he used them to enact large amounts of pain onto Palpatine as revenge for everything he had done. The rest of Vader's life would be agony. Personally, he would suffer for the losses of everyone that he ever cared about. He would ensure that Palpatine lived a long and painful death, one that would last 40 years into Vader's old age. During that time, the Empire would flourish, and the Jedi themselves would go extinct. The legacy of Emperor Vader would be that of bringing order to the galaxy, and ridding it of the insurgents of the rebels and Jedi for good. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is a 2-hour long story. I spent about 6 days writing this, so honestly it makes sense why it took so long for this to come out. I still have to edit it. It is still Wednesday, the 27th, so this is probably going to take me all morning. So just on account of that, leave a like down below. For my sanity, that is. But this was a really intense story, and I wanted it to stay that way. And it never was intended to be a 10,000 subscriber special, and I think I'm going to keep it at 2 hours because of that. But, I mean, I really wanted to write a good story here. I wanted to flesh out the characters, and I really wanted to have the motivation of these characters be known throughout the story. And I feel like I accomplished that. I think there was a lot of interesting, even new concepts in this, but I really liked the bond between Luke and Vader. I think they would have had a very nice bond. And while there's a lot to cover here in the story, I wanted all the fights to be brutal, and I wanted all the fights to make you feel the pain that the people were going through, the fear that people were going through. And I think that's the concept of this story, and I think the story itself is found in fear. I think the story itself is the definition of fear. It's total fear. And I think that's what was intended by this story, fear. I think I think the story is the telling of fear and the telling of what happens when people with too much power use that fear against others. And I think Luke in the story would have embodied that power of darkness. I mean, being trained by Vader, growing up on a Sith planet, and just interacting with the darkness on a daily basis for 13 years, he would have been extremely powerful. And I do believe he probably would have been as powerful, if not more powerful, than Revenge of the Sith Anakin. And I think that's where it all starts. I think Luke would have just been an unstoppable force, even compared to the Emperor, and I think he would fall short at the hands of Leia, because I think Leia would be the polar opposite to him in the Force. I think they would be a dyad in the Force of sorts, because they really they would be polar opposites. One would be polar, like full dark, and the other one would be full light. And yeah, I mean, I really hope you guys enjoyed this. This one, woo! I'm gonna tell you, I'm not a person that talks a lot, and talking for 2 hours, I'm not gonna end up speaking for the rest of the week. But the story was very, very intentionally emotional, and I think that's what I wanted to come from this, and I wanted you guys to feel that, and I wanted you guys to feel the connection between Vader and Luke, and I wanted you guys to feel like Luke had the chance for redeeming, and though it wasn't possible, and I feel like it never would have been possible, I think this story could have gone completely differently, and I think it really hinged on the idea of, well, is Vader going to turn to the light, or is he going to stay in the dark? And I think it could have gone either way. I think with having his own son, I think it's very possible that he could have turned to the light, but I think he also could have stayed in the dark, using his son as a tool for himself. And I think the true irony at the end of this is that at the end, when Vader is going to die, he's going to kill the Emperor, and he's going to die himself. And tragically, he'll be the one that does bring balance to the Force. The Force will be balanced out. There will be no more Sith. There will be no more Skywalkers. There will be no more Palpatines. Everyone will have died, and the Force will kind of just be seen as this lost religion. And I think it's really a tragic ending, and I think I went through a lot of iterations. Originally I thought I was going to have Luke and Vader fight over slavery, and then I kind of lost that because I felt like the bond between father and son would be stronger than that. And I really wanted a lot of personal, not my own personal, but a lot of personal feelings that people would feel for a father figure to go into this. And I feel like some of those were accomplished, and I really hope you guys enjoy this. This one is a very, very, very prideful story that I've just written for you guys. And I hope you guys enjoyed this. This one was special. Anyways, everyone, thank you again for 10,000 subscribers. I will be announcing that giveaway really soon, so please stay tuned for that. As for all of you that are new, subscribe for a chance to win something on our next giveaway. I have to decide what I'll be giving away for either 25,000 or 50,000. Let me know what you want the next giveaway to be at. I think after 50, I'll turn it to 100, but we have to get there first, so you guys have to help me get there. Let's keep going there. Let's blow this video up too. Make this video huge. Share it to everyone, please. I put a lot of time and effort into this, and you can see it because I just hit the 2-hour mark on my recording. You might have a much shorter version because of the editing that I put into it, but anyways, I love you all. Spread the love, and always remember, my friends, may the Force be with you.